Thank everybody for joining us. It's delightful to see so many people turn out for this talk. I want to introduce Robert Cvornyek. He's an assistant teaching professor at Florida State University, Panama City, and former chair of the history department at Rhode Island College, where he specialized in sports history. He received his PhD in history from Columbia University. He has written extensively on the intersection of race, sports, and cultural expression, and recently edited the autobiography of Baseball Hall of Famer Effa Manley. He is currently working on a documentary film that explores the money game in New England African American baseball. Robert also co-directs the program It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing, Baseball, Jazz, and Black Cultural Expression. And so I will start us off by just with a question to Bob, unless Bob, you want to say anything before I start with the questions. You want to?
No, it's just a pleasure. I'll reserve my thanks, I think, for the end of my talk, but it's always good to see you, Rick, and always pleased to be able to engage in a program for the Rhode Island Historical Society.
We're delighted to have you talk tonight and have this conversation. So can you give us a brief biographical sketch of Mr. Charles Thomas before we talk about his contributions as an athlete and counselor to so many youngsters in Providence?
Yes, the path traveled by Mr. Thomas to Providence is one which is, firmly grounded in the African American experience. He's born in Heard County, Georgia, to Charles and Stony Watkins Thomas, and this is likely a sharecropping family. Census records would indicate that Charles was raised in a sharecropping family, but then the family decides to make the move to Dayton, Ohio, and Charles is very young, around 4 years old, and his father becomes a foundry worker. Most people don't think of Dayton as a major destination during the Great Migration, but Dayton had a significant industrial base. The National Cash Register, for example, had employed many people. But the critical thing about, I think, Mr. Thomas's time in Dayton, Ohio, is the fact that he attends Dunbar High School, Lawrence Dunbar High School, which is an all African American high school, all African American teachers, all African American administrators. And, I had an opportunity to speak with Mr. Thomas's wife last night, and she once again reinforced the fact that it was Mr. Thomas's time, really, at Dunbar High School that significantly impacted many of his actions later in life. I would have thought that it would have been a lot of his sports career, and it is. It doesn't have to be one or the other; it can be both. But in this instance, it's hard to overestimate the impact of that environment on Charles, and ultimately what Charles does with his life when he completes his football career. He excels in athletics at Dunbar High School, and he has a mentor there, and that mentor is Mr. Moreland Ford. Moreland Ford is a teacher, but he's also a coach, and he went to school at Boston University, and he sort of promises Boston University that when he gets out to Dunbar High School, that he will send BU a promising scholar athlete. And that, of course, is Mr. Thomas. And Mr. Thomas is accepted and fully expects to begin matriculating at Boston University, except for the fact that his parents come to him and say, we can't afford to send you to Boston. And this is where Dunbar High School, under the direction of Mr. Fort, runs something called a dime day. And the dime day is every student at Dunbar High School brings whatever they can, usually a dime, sometimes pennies. And at the end of the day, they collected all of that money, and Mr. Thomas was able to make that move. And that made all the difference. Once he gets to Boston University, he becomes a nationally sort of recognized athlete. There's no question about that. And when he gets to Boston University, and we'll talk about this, I think, a little bit later in the program, one of his sort of signature sports achievements is that he is very fun. He plays a fundamental role in integrating collegiate football in the American South while he's at Boston University. At the end of his senior year, he's excels in baseball, and he gets picked up by the Newark Eagles, a professional baseball team, which we'll talk a little bit more about again later in the program. We talk about his athletic career. But then he's inducted into the Army, August 15th, 1942, and he will spend a number of years in the Army. He'll be discharged in November of 1945. When he's discharged from the military, he goes back to Boston, takes a job with the Shaw House as a counselor, does a little bit of work for the Boston Parks Department, but he is immediately recognized for a position in Providence, Rhode Island, under the newly developed recreation department. In 1947, the recreation department comes into its own. It had always been part of the Parks Department in Providence. And in 1947, they separate. And one of the newer facilities that they open will be the Doyle Street facility. And the head of the recreation department, Jack Cronin, who has known of Mr. Thomas's character and exploits and all of that stuff, tabs him for that job. And that's how he gets to Rhode Island in 1948 and spends the vast majority of his life here.
So that's fascinating. You consider Mr. Thomas an important figure in the history of sport. Tell us a little bit about how sport history has developed over the years and why Mr. Thomas represents a development of the field.
Well, sports history is now considered, a legitimate field within the discipline. That wasn't always the case. Much of the early sport history was not written by historians and tended to focus on what we now call sort of character education. The focus was on biography and how the qualities of certain athletes should be emulated. And this was heavily gendered. It was heavily gendered in the sense of what was expected of men or how men were expected to behave, right? So Catherine Jay, for example, has a wonderful chapter in her book, on sport in America, in which he sort of goes into the issue of how early sports history dealt really with two issues. One, this notion of gender, and the other issue she kind of ties in is this notion of Cold War America and how the combat of athletics is providing what's needed among young men in a world that is sort of uncertain with regards to the Cold War. So you get a lot of that, sort of, we call that sort of the old baseball history. And then there's a sense of nostalgia too, represented in these early works that sort of emphasize the virtues of an unchanging or enduring America. This is, particularly true for baseball and things of that sort. You wouldn't see Mr. Thomas in the old, on the old sport history. But now we do, because the new sports history takes on issues of race, takes on issues of gender, takes on issues of class. And I think that puts him sort of squarely in these new interpretations that professional historians, who are very measured in their outlook. I mean, they're good historians. They analyze, they interpret, they historicize, they place things in context. All of that now has become part of the sports scene, and my sense is that Mr. Thomas now fits nicely, fits very comfortably into that new sports history.
Fabulous. So, what role did he play in the integration of collegiate sport below the Mason-Dixon line?
That is, that is a difficult question to answer because there are so many variables in play. So, when we talk about integration, we talk about it in a number of ways. You can integrate a team, and I think that's how many of us think of it. Or you can integrate a section of the country with regards to collegiate football. That has not received as much attention as sort of the integration of teams. And a lot of that has to do with professional sports as well. So, we know who integrated Major League Baseball. We know who integrated Major League Basketball. We know who the NBA. We know who integrated the NHL, all of those things. But collegiate basketball, the integration of collegiate basketball football, excuse me, takes time. It takes sort of several decades. So it's a different way of sort of understanding, the process of integration. And the other issue is, when we talk about integrating the South, Mr. Thomas plays a fundamental role in integrating. We say below the Mason-Dixon line because he integrates collegiate football in Maryland. Now, Maryland, was a slave state. Maryland had all kinds of difficulties during Reconstruction. Maryland, I know, sides with the Union during the Civil War, but Maryland's a tough place, and colleges in Maryland refuse to play teams that have African American players. Now, in New England, you had a number of African American players playing on all kinds of sports teams. In the early part of the 20th century, that's nothing new. Problem is, can you bring those players down south to play? And that sort of brings into question this issue of a gentleman's agreement. We use that term in baseball, but you can easily use that term in collegiate sports as well. Gentleman's agreement is it's up to the president of the college in consultation with the athletic director as to whether or not you're playing a home game and whether or not you're going to allow an African American player from another team to play. So, University of Western Maryland, in 1939, decides Charles Thomas can't come down and play. That they only want a white team playing, and they play their home games in Baltimore. I think they're out of Westminster. In 1940, Charles Thomas plays in Boston against that same team because, again, the idea was it was up to the home team to determine whether or not Black players can play. And then 1941 comes around, and there are significant demonstrations at Boston University to allow Charles Thomas to play in Baltimore, in Maryland. And there is a consultation between the president of Boston University, whose name is Marsh at the time, and he calls up the president of the University of Western Maryland, a guy by the name of Holloway, and Holloway doesn't want to budge. But Marsh convinces him, and this I think is fascinating, and it speaks to an issue I know we're going to talk about a little bit later too. Marsh says, "Hey, listen, this is 1941, and the world is in a difficult place when it comes to issues of race." And he's certainly talking about the rise of authoritarian regimes in Germany and in Italy and Nazism and fascism and all of that. And he makes his argument on that basis. It's not on the basis of, hey, listen, sport should be a fair playing field, and African Americans are first-class citizens and deserve to be treated as first-class citizens. The appeal is made almost exclusively on the basis of sort of what's happening throughout the world in relation to World War II, and then America's eventual entry into that war, just a couple of months ahead. Charles Thomas is, is allowed to play. The game isn't without incident. Players rough them up and things of that sort. So there's always that, that sense of, hey, there's still resistance on the part of some of the players on the team. But for the most part, that's a huge event. That's a significant event. If you talk to folks at Harvard, they're going to say, hey, listen, it's Chester Pierce is the one who really sort of breaks the color line in the South. Harvard plays Virginia, and Virginia allows, Chester Pierce to play, but there's no Chester Pierce without Charles Thomas. And there's a 6-year difference between when Charles Thomas is playing in 41 and Pierce again plays in 47. But it's not easy. Mr. Thomas heads into Baltimore, and they're afraid. He can't stay at the Lord Baltimore Hotel. He has to be taken to what was then called the Druid Hills section of Baltimore, and stayed there. For his safety. So all of those, personal sacrifices and all of those challenges, Mr. Thomas met at a very early a point in the integration of collegiate football. Why that story isn't, a regional, I'm not even sure what to call it. I mean, it's just a significant, important event that the fact that sometimes it goes unnoticed is it's in some cases incomprehensible to me.
So maybe that kind of feeds into this sort of that most historians trace the development of the modern civil rights movement to World War II. So how does Mr. Thomas represent this interpretation?
Right. Yeah. So in 1942, Mr. Thomas, as we mentioned, is inducted into the service, and he's deployed to Camp Lee in Virginia. And I just want you to think about this for a minute. He's deployed to Camp Lee in Virginia. That's Robert E. Lee. That's the Confederate general who defends slavery. He's also placed in a segregated unit, a segregated quartermaster unit. And that segregated unit had offered a lot less opportunity for Black soldiers than it did for white. And at the same time, they're telling Mr. Thomas that you have to fight against an enemy whose ideology is sort of based on notions of racial superiority or ethnic superiority. That's the motivation behind the Double V campaign. Black soldiers during World War II will often flash what we would consider to be the victory sign, but it's actually a double, sort of V sign in the sense of, yes, we will defeat the enemies of the country here. But we will, when we return, we will also defeat that same kind of ideology of racial superiority that we're fighting against. Well, in the case of Mr. Thomas in North Africa. So Mr. Thomas goes off to war and he earns 5 Bronze Stars, which, isn't surprising. And then he comes back to Camp Lee in Virginia, and this is 1945. And Camp Lee had this incredible baseball team, well known in military circles as one of the premier baseball teams. And in 1944, actually, they win this, North African Theater of Operations Championship and all of this. In 1945, the white baseball team, again in the segregated military, asked Mr. Thomas if he would join the team because he's that good. They want to ensure in 1945 that they'll have the same success they had in 1944. So Mr. Thomas, essentially integrates military baseball in 1945. And that's like fully 3 years before, Truman desegregates the military in 48, And I think that's a critical point. You begin to see, at least in the case of Mr. Thomas, a breakdown, in the segregation of the military. And one of the places that happens is in the is on the baseball diamond. So here you have Mr. Thomas, who begins to shatter the color line in collegiate football, certainly a major and significant figure in that. And then in military baseball, he's one of the earliest. I can't say he's the earliest, but he's certainly one of the earliest to desegregate, a military baseball team. So when you take a look at how he used in this case his athletic ability to bring integration, I think that's those are two incredibly significant stories.
So apparently, after Mr. Thomas's arrival in Providence in 1948. His life provides an important insight into the city's African American social and cultural life. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So Mr. Thomas arrives in Providence in 1948, and he takes over his responsibilities as the director of the Doyle Street Recreation Center, which will later become the Benefit Street Recreation Center. In fact, he's instrumental in sort of making that move. So when you look at it, Mr. Thomas's, I don't want to segment Mr. Thomas's life into these little boxes, but his career path is one in which he is constantly assisting, helping, and advising kids. That's what he does, for a living. But that's not the point. I think he's really someone who's totally vested in the community. That's certainly reflected in the work he does, but it's reflected in the work that he does outside of his job, and the way in which he mentored and counseled so many youngsters during his lifetime. And the other issue is during this time period, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, let's say, there were certainly many more fraternal or civic organizations that African Americans belonged to. The same, this can be held, is true for whites as well, but there were many more civic and fraternal organizations available, and his membership in those committees was outstanding, irreproachable, benevolent association. He was a member of the NAACP, the Urban League, Veterans of Foreign Wars. The list goes on and on. So he was devoted to the community in that respect as well. And my sense is that those organizations played a much more important role in the community then than they do now. But I think it's his work with youngsters that's so crucial. I know that Mrs. Thomas has just a treasure trove of letters written from either parents or youngsters, indicating that without Mr. Thomas, without his help and without his guidance, life would have been much more difficult. I do want to reference one example, though, which I think speaks to his role in the community. I think some of us remember, and folks have written about this, but there's not a lot written about it. Hope High School in 1969 had gone through a difficult period. African American students at Hope had raised a number of concerns about the quality of education they were receiving. Some of the teachers on the faculty, curricular issues, and things of that sort. And in May, early May of 1969, they walk out. They walk out of their classes. They don't walk out of the building, but they assemble in the auditorium. Well, who's there to help? Mr. Thomas. And Mr. Thomas is there to help first to make sure that those kids are protected. When you have that kind of a demonstration or an action, there's always a fear that whether police or security are going to come in. He literally put himself between, I don't want to say law enforcement, but certainly those security forces and the kids, and listen to those kids and try to translate what their concerns were to superintendents and principals and things of that. So, when you look at the history of the 1969 demonstration at Hope High School, you're going to get a lot about the school superintendent or the union leader. I mean, if you really want to understand what happened in '69 in Hope High School, you have to understand Mr. Thomas's role in that. Mr. Thomas is there because the kids trust him. Many of them grew up with him, as a leader at Benefit Street, and the parents trusted him implicitly because of the kind of person he was, the genuine, giving, caring person that he was. So I think, if you're looking at an event which at least just speaks volumes about how he was trusted, that certainly would be one.
Well, the final kind of question that we want to ask before opening it to other questions is, did you encounter, you must have, challenges when researching Mr. Thomas's life, and how did you navigate those?
The answer to that question, I think, is going to surprise the audience a little bit, because it's not the typical response that I think an historian gives. And it has a lot to do with the folks that I spoke to about Mr. Thomas, especially his most elegant wife, Gladys, without whom tonight's presentation surely would not be possible, and a number of other folks, Reverend Kathy Soares. I spoke to her not long ago, but I began talking to people about Mr. Thomas about 20 years ago. And every time I interviewed someone about Mr. Thomas, they would begin with, I loved Mr. Thomas, or we loved Mr. Thomas. And as an historian, I should have followed up on that story. I should have said, why did you love him? But instead, I simply sort of acknowledged that and then moved on to questions about his sports career, or about the role that he, eventually played in the community. I think if I had listened to why they loved him so much, I would have understood the community a lot better, and the role that he played in the community. I'm a sports historian, and I focused on those aspects of his life, and I'm happy for that. But if I do have one regret, if I could go back 20 years ago, my simple follow-up question would have been, why? Why do you love him so much? So I lost a bit of an opportunity there, but over the years, I have had an opportunity to speak with Mrs. Thomas so many times, and I think she's helped me understand, why he was loved so much. But I think the answer to that question would have fully informed me of the role that he played. So that's one, and that's why I say that's an unusual answer to that question. I'd be happy to address what I would consider the more traditional challenges one has if somebody has a question. But for the most part, if we're transitioning into questions, and if I do have to make a sort of a final statement, I began this journey with Mr. Thomas thinking, here's an incredible athlete who was involved in certainly historic events or historic changes, and now I think I look at Mr. Thomas as a good man who happened to be an athlete, and I think my interpretation has shifted a little bit. I mean, I wrote a little bit on Mr. Thomas a couple of years ago, and it was all sports. It was fun. It was an example of the new sports history. I think if I had to go back and write something again, and I plan to write something again, it would focus on the untold story of of how he embraced and how the community embraced him.
Well, thank you so much for answering the questions that I had, and I hope that folks in the audience have some, and will, I don't
I
know.
know we have a couple of images too that that we may want to go through. People may want to see Mr. Thomas. So if we have a few minutes, I think. So that's the standard sort of stock image of Mr. Thomas during the years he was at Boston University. Now, Mr. Thomas is a 9-letter athlete, one of the last, if not the last, which means that he lettered his sophomore year, junior year, and senior year in 3 sports, which is sort of unheard of today, and even back then, pretty much unheard of. Captained the baseball team in 1942, which was rare to have an African American captain, a baseball team. But just in terms of athletic ability, hard to find anyone at Boston University that matches that. Of course, he's a member of the Boston University Athletic Hall of Fame, was inducted back in, I want to say 69. Go ahead, yeah, and then you can go to the next photo. This is what I referred to earlier, Boston U back on team after Big Dime Day. I'm not going to read this to you, but it just simply indicates that the significant role that Dunbar High School, I think, plays in Mr. Thomas's life. I mean, if Mr. Thomas spends all of his time in Providence, and I'm saying all of his time in Providence after 1948, serving the community, I think he learns that lesson back at Dunbar High School. And again, with an all-Black faculty, all-Black students, all-Black administrators, who understood the concerns of African-American students, but who ensured that those African-American students were going to be successful. So yeah, we can keep going. And this is, just a little bit about the backdrop to the desegregation of collegiate football in the South. At the bottom, you can see that you had students protesting at Boston University, but what's really interesting is that students at Morgan State also demonstrated, historically Black college in Baltimore. And they invite, Mr. Thomas to a, I guess you would call it a pep rally. I'm not sure, or some sort of rally. Here they are, Baltimore students cheering on Mr. Thomas and his team from Boston. And I think this is also the one which sort of addresses the issue of its time under present world conditions. Yeah, so 2/3 of the way down. Under present world conditions, this is not a time for intolerance and discrimination. The basis of this one is so significant, I think, because it's placed within a world context. Yeah, we can keep going. Pretty much the same. I just wanted to give you at least a little bit of a sense. These are articles that have appeared not just in the African American press, although he gets wonderful coverage in the African American press. These are articles in national newspapers, Boston Globe, things of that sort. So you can't underestimate how the nation, at least it was fixed on this particular issue. And this is just a political illustration, or illustration from the Boston University newspaper, sort of celebrating this. Let the band play Dixie's a little awkward, but I think we can move on with that. The reason I chose this image is that long before Mr. Thomas gets to Providence in 1948, he's known well throughout the state. He's a member of the celebrated Boston Colored Giants. I mean, they play in Providence, they play in Newport. I mean, he's well known. Here he's playing for the Uxbridge team, the Uxbridge worsted team, and those teams played in Providence and in Rhode Island regularly. So he was known here before 48. Wasn't that he comes in and he's unknown at 48, and that's the purpose, I think, for these images. This is Mr. Thomas's draft card. And I think what you see here is that his address in Dayton, Ohio is typed over with 71 Crawford Street, Newark, New Jersey, because he's playing professionally for the Newark Eagles. That's another thing that I think a lot of people don't know about Mr. Thomas. He's a professional ball player. I mean, he's playing alongside Larry Doby. Larry Doby is the person who desegregates Major League Baseball in the American League with the Cleveland Indians. And I'll tell you something that's interesting. Larry Doby goes to Charlie Thomas for advice on hitting. That's how good he was. And this is a story that gets reprised over and over again. I mean, I think people in the community know the Davy Lopes story. Davy Lopes was an East Providence kid who plays Major League Baseball beginning in the early 70s, 72s, has a wonderful career and then goes on and manages. And when Davy Lopes is struggling, especially at bat, who does he call? Mr. Thomas, Charles Thomas. I think, Mrs. Thomas can tell you how many times Davy Lopes calls her husband for support, for encouragement. Again, it was that trust, it was that love, but it was also the baseball expertise. That's a very interesting draft card. Student at BU, but also playing professionally for the Eagles. It's a nice artifact. Yeah, we can move. Yeah, it's Mr. Thomas playing for the Eagles. He played outfield. He plays for Effa Manley. Effa Manley is the only woman in the Baseball Hall of Fame. The Newark Eagles are a premier professional baseball team. And we can keep going, for time's sake. And there's the baseball team he integrates, the Travelers, the camp lead Travelers. That's Mr. Thomas in 1945. That's one of your premier military teams. That's 3 years before Truman desegregates the military. And that's just a wonderful picture of Mr. Thomas. I mean, I think so dignified, so serious, so all-encompassing in terms of the person that he was. I just love that image, and I think we'll probably end with that one.
Connor, do you want to take it away, or or are we reading things for the chat? Anybody have a question? We have a hand, Elisa.
Hi, Bob. It's actually Leslie, not Elisa.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm using her. Never mind. So I was really interested, Bob, about what you said about the character studies, the early sports history. Were those the domain of like reporters and sports writers, or was that historians?
Sometimes, no, very rarely historians.
Yeah, that's okay.
It was a lot of it was journalistic.
Got it.
Like I said, Catherine J. really does a good job of gender on that. The idea here is that and again, I'll kind of go back to the Cold War era. If you're suffering through a crisis of masculinity for whatever reason, during the Cold War, read these sports books. And sports was a way to train, combatants and all of that. I kind of got hooked on the gendered sort of part of all of that. But a lot of people also talk about how early sports history is very nostalgic, and sometimes you still even see that in today's movies, especially in today's sports movies. There's this sort of wonderful golden past, that gets represented in the sort of the unchanging nature of baseball and things of that sort. But yeah, I'd look at Catherine J stuff. She does a wonderful job on all of that. To be honest with you, I think it's the African American reporters, both nationally and locally. So locally, you got folks like Mabe Counts or William Sheep Jackson. If those types of journalists are writing the first draft of history, they wrote a fairly good draft when it came to issues of race.
Okay.
But nationally, if you're looking at books that people are writing, in the old sports history, there's no race, it's
right.
There's no gender, and class is just so absent from everything.
We
Thanks.
don't have, oh, was someone just about to ask a question?
Sure.
Carl?
Oh, yep. Thank you. So Bob, could you talk a little bit more about because this was just wonderful, and thank you so very much. Could you explain how this plays into this really interesting private and public dialogue about civil rights and about it's such an interesting thing because you have popular baseball and so forth, and yet there are these two dynamics going on at the same time. Could you address that just a little bit more, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have sort of a public narrative around sport and a public narrative around baseball, in particular. And it's one that doesn't include, the difficulties that African Americans or other people of color experienced, or especially issues, kind of related to gender. This is all, pre-Title IX and all of that. I think there's a public narrative around, the crucial role that baseball plays in American society. I think the difference is, in the hands of trained historians, and in the and in the hands of what I'll call the private transcript. People of color who are talking about sports, are saying, listen, that's not the way it is. The public transcript is sports is a representative of American democracy. Sports is an example of, the meritocracy that we as Americans value, and there's nothing more American than baseball and all of that. And you get off. Then you get a private transcript among African Americans in particular, which is saying, where is this coming? I mean, this is absolutely, it's BS. That's the private trends. That African Americans are talking, with each other about. So I think you have that sort of interesting dynamic. African Americans form leagues of their own, and Mr. Thomas certainly played on all black leagues. But you also get somebody like Mr. Thomas, I think, who was able to navigate both an African American and a white world to the benefit of African Americans, and sort of reach some of that, and to sort of push the civil rights movement agenda and the civil rights movement along a little bit. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I think, the new sports history is far more interested in what we call the private agenda. What are people really thinking about sports as contrasted to what Leslie was talking about earlier, this sort of narrative about, I mean, I go back to character education. That's not the best way of saying it, but it's a view of America which isn't accurate.
Thank you so much.
I don't have a question, but I do have a statement. I know you asked the question of why do we love Mr. Thomas so much.
Yeah.
I will respond to that as one who was under his tutelage. Mr. Thomas was my coach from Benefit Street Recreation Center. He coached the women's basketball team there, and we were winners. He took us from Rhode Island to Boston to New York and all over. Mr. Thomas was a father to many of us and many others who didn't have fathers. He listened. He didn't always tell on you, but he got you straight. He let you know what road you ought to be on, but he didn't always. You could always trust him. And he said what he meant, and he meant what he said. But he was fun. He was Benefit Street Recreation Center along with a couple other people like Mrs. Butler, and there were several of them that was there. And we just loved him. I graduated from Hope High School a year before all of that 69 thing happened, but Mr. Thomas was there with us all the way through. We love him. He was at my wedding. He was in my life all till now, until he passed. So he was a great mentor to many, many, many of us on the east side of Providence and Benefit Street Recreation Center. So that's why we love him so.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have had an opportunity to speak to a number of folks more recently, and the conversation has turned to that question, to revisit that question, and so much of it reflects what you just said. Yeah, thank you so much for saying that.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add, also, I played for Mr. Thomas, and Eva and I were on the same team. And the thing about Mr. Thomas was what I loved about him, he was fair. It didn't matter. I know I was one of his favorites, if I must say so. But if I did something wrong and someone else did something wrong, he did not let me slide and punish them more. We all got the same punishment. It did not matter. He was always fair, always the same. When he said, if you do X, and I was one who had the tendency of rolling my eyes, if somebody hit
Amen.
me, going down the court, be quiet, Negro. And he said, the next time you roll your eyes, you're coming out the game. And a girl slapped me, and I rolled my eyes at her. And next thing you know, you hear the whistle blow, and they said substitution, and I was out. He put you on the bench. So he was instrumental in us going to college. Education, he was very big on education. He really pushed education. And if it wasn't for him, Eva and I wouldn't have gone to college, because he's the one that steered us in the right direction and to go into the right programs to be able to get our college education paid for. So he's someone who I love on all of my life. And I can't say enough about him. He was just a wonderful, wonderful man.
Amen.
Yeah, I know he was very much involved with URI's talent development program, which I know.
Yes.
Yeah,
Well, we were the first group.
yeah,
It was called pre-matriculation.
yeah.
And we were the first group to go down to URI. Some of you, because we graduated in '68, and he was the one who got us into that, and that's how we went to college.
Amen.
I'm going to ask you a question if I can. So one of the things that I also hear, outside of the fact that Mr. Thomas was loved, was that he was just so humble, and no one would know. I mean, we talked a lot today about these incredible roles he played in dismantling desegregation and all, and his military career. He never spoke about that, from what I gather.
I learned some new things tonight listening.
Amen.
Mr. Thomas did not speak about himself at all, as far as what he did, any of his accomplishments. He was just out there helping the next person. One person at a time.
Right. He didn't waste words. He just acted, and
Mhm.
you knew it.
Yes.
And he has a wonderful Mrs. Thomas's bitch. She was always right there too. She was
Oh,
always, she's
But you know,
wonderful, wonderful lady.
Mrs. Thomas, can I tell the story about you?
Kathy, don't stop.
She's still on mute. Well, I have to tell the story because Eva and I, we really should have been ashamed of ourselves. But I have to tell the story. When I got married, Mr. Thomas, of course, was at my wedding, and he walked in, and Eva, she was my ride or die, my maid of honor. So we're at the head table, and he walks in, and he has this woman with him. He said, "Oh, and this is my friend, Miss Johnson." He said, "Miss Johnson?" I said, "Can you?" And he left, and I said to Eva, "Can you believe that he gonna bring some woman to my wedding?" As because for us, he was our Mr. Thompson, and Thomas, and it's not like we thought he wasn't supposed to have a life outside of being our Mr. Thomas. And then when he got married, we were so upset that he's gonna marry her, and we were really angry. And then we had to make a decision. Said, if we're gonna keep Mr. Thomas in our life, we have to decide either we're gonna like her or not. So we went over and said we have to go over and visit. So we went to the house and to visit, and we got to know Mrs. Thomas, and we loved her just as much as we loved him. But yeah.
Amen.
Sorry, Mrs. Thomas, I had to tell it.
well,
Thank you so much for sharing all those stories.
and I know that there are a number of folks from the Ebenezer Baptist Church that are with us tonight. And, Mr. Thomas had been a deacon and had served as a superintendent of Sunday schools for 9 years, and is again a very well loved and very well respected person at Ebenezer. If I can just editorialize real quick, because I don't want to take up too much time. There is a room which is dedicated to Mr. Thomas at Ebenezer Baptist Church. It's a resource room, one which supports materials for Sunday school or Bible study, and that's wonderful. There has to be a recreation center, there has to be a ball field, there has to be something in Providence named after Mr. Thomas. Mr. Thomas, like I said, did not speak about his athletic achievements and his career all that much. He saw his mission as very different. Sports got him to a certain point, but really what Mr. Thomas was about helping kids. And the fact that the city of Providence does not have a major recreation facility named after him is a shame. And I would certainly do anything and everything I possibly can to assist in an effort to make sure that Mr. Thomas is recognized in this way. He's got it all. He's historically significant. What a member of the community, and certainly someone who led a purposeful life.
Amen. You can count us in when you do it, or if we can help. Yeah. Amen.
I think we have time for one more question if somebody wants to use the Zoom raise hand function so I see you, or send it in the chat.
Yes, I was wondering about, I was surprised to see a picture that he was in the Blackstone Valley League in Uxbridge. Was it unusual to have Black players in that league? How did he end up there, however briefly? Was that before or after he was with the Newark Eagles?
Very unusual. Mr. Thomas was an individual who broke color lines throughout his entire life, simply because he was that good. I mean, even if you take a look at the time he's in Providence, He's playing in the Tim O'Neill amateur leagues. He's playing for a team called Toodleos, which is majority white. So James, I think the answer to your question is no. It's not common to have African American players playing in that league, but given the caliber of his talent, teams took Mr. Thomas on, and that was also true for his athletic career later in Rhode Island, which we really didn't get a chance to talk too much about. I mean, I'll tell you a quick story. Last time I spoke here, we talked about the Circle Athletic Club as being the first truly integrated baseball team, amateur baseball team in Rhode Island. Mr. Thomas doesn't play for that team, but that team is so good in 1951 that they make it to the National Baseball Congress World Series in Wichita, Kansas. And the person who coaches that team, Biffo Duarte, before they head out to Wichita, Kansas, make sure that Charlie Thomas is on that team. And I think that speaks to the issue of, if you want a quality player, are you willing to overlook the fact, at least in this league, that he's African American? And that just seemed to be the story of his life. That's the blow he strikes against segregation. He integrates so many teams along the way, but I'm telling you, the Army story is exceptionally significant. Oliver Brown, who's the plaintiff in the Brown versus the Board of Education decision, will sometimes say it's World War II, really, that ignites the modern civil rights movement. He also says that towards the end of that war, you begin to see a little bit of the breakdown in the segregation, mostly for logistic purposes. And I think Mr. Thomas sort of represents that in a very, very, very dramatic way. He's in the middle of so much history that he didn't share, really, even with the people that he cared so much about. So it's time to uncover that. But like I said, and maybe we should end with this, because I think the program's coming to an end. I understand that, but my perception, my understanding as an historian of Mr. Thomas has shifted. His work in the community, well, I hate to say it, is far more important, far more historic, I think, than the things we discussed earlier.
Thank you so much, Bob.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Bob. Thank you, everyone who shared personal stories about their connections to Mr. Thomas. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and we hope to see you at another virtual program again soon.